Good evening and welcome to the Shrewsbury Historical Society. This is our October 2021 presentation. Thank you very much for joining our program tonight. We have a wonderful speaker plan. Before we begin tonight, could we please take a moment to remember Donald Johnson? He was an active member in the society. He was also a board member for quite a few years. He always helped out. Could we have a moment of silence for him? Thank you. Next is our curator's report. Christine Gustafson will report.
Hi, I'm Chris Gustafson, Vice President. Curator Linda Davis reported that Betty Green, who lives in Maine, sent us some old receipts from the 1800s for Shrewsbury residents Elijah Hapgood and James Hall. They include Elijah Hapgood receipt for paid taxes in 1825, Elijah Hapgood four-wheel carriage rental in 1815, a Hapgood furniture receipt for 1816, a James Hall tax receipt for 1816, and a corn exchange banknote from 1889. The Society also purchased a new printer for the curator.
Okay, thank you very much. Next is our treasurer's report. Jeffy Underkoffler will report. Jeff.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to announce tonight that at our last meeting, the board approved some donation we gave for Light the Common. So as you're going through the center of town, you'll be able to see the common light up, and the Shrewsbury Historical Society contribute to that. We also sent money to help to restore the meeting house at the old Sturbridge Village to help with their contribution to rebuild, I think it was a roof from their building that needed repaired. All of our finances are in order. Our biggest expense for this month was insurance for both the liability for 1830 schoolhouse and also the number 5 schoolhouse. And we also had utilities and maintenance upkeep that we did for the facility. So I want to thank you all. And for those of you who haven't yet sent in your registrations, please continue to do so because that's what, and it will enable you to get our newsletters and also being invited to join these wonderful meetings that are being sponsored. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thank you. Shrewsbury Historical Society program tonight is Dr. Edward Austin Flynt, Physician of the American Revolutionary War by Donald Pottle. Shrewsbury channels 28 and 328 are available on demand online. About the program, Dr. Edward Flynt served as a physician in the Continental Army under General Artemus Ward, who was second in command to General George Washington. Edward Flynt, 1733 to 1818, apprenticed to Dr. Simon Tufts in the art of physics and chirurgery in Grafton, Massachusetts. Most notably, Dr. Flynt periodically treated sick and wounded soldiers during the American Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783. Our presenter tonight, Donald Pottle, is a 50-year veteran of education from Shrewsbury High School and Shepard's Eye Research Institute, Boston, Mass. He portrays in the first person Dr. Edward Austin Flynt, a generic physician of the American Revolutionary War. Today, Don, as Dr. Austin Flynt, has presented his first person generic 18th century colonial medicine reenactments to more than 50 audiences, including historical and medical societies throughout Worcester County. Mr. Pottle.
Thank you for your invitation to visit with you tonight. About 30 years ago, I presented my program to a live audience in the 1830 brick schoolhouse. Tonight is the first time that I will present my program in a virtual venue. I am obliged now, as I was then, to make some preliminary disclosures about my character and presentation. I should tell you that some images may be disturbing to sensitive viewers. Dr. Edward Flynt is a generic character created from an amalgamation of authentic medical doctors and their practices during the American Revolutionary War. All of the apparatus and materials used in my presentation are reproductions constructed from images of authentic devices. None are actual antiques. The medications shown here are harmless facsimiles of the real products. All instruments have been rendered as safe as possible. Please do not replicate the procedures that you are about to see on people or animals. The agenda for my presentation includes a description of the background and origin of my Dr. Flynt character and descriptions of Dr. Flynt's apparatus and script. The core of my presentation includes descriptions of the medicinals used in the 1700s, dental practices, cataract coaching, leeching and bloodletting, concussions and trepanation, musket ball removal, smallpox variolation, leg fractures and amputations, and lastly, Dr. Flynt's classroom presentations. It all started about 30 years ago in the old Shrewsbury High School on Oak Street, when an Austrian monk of the 1800s, Gregor Mendel, visited my classroom. Gregor Mendel is credited for discovering the laws of heredity through his work with pea plants. During his visit, students were invited to describe their plant experiments to Mendel, which was not an easy task since he had never heard of DNA nor ever seen a chromosome. Mercifully, Mendel spoke English during his visit. His native language was German. Can people communicate with their plants? This is a question that my students raised after viewing the Nova television program, The Green Machine. To help answer it, I attached the lily plant to an electroencephalography machine. Students carried out their own experiments and drew their own conclusions. Have a look at what's happening here. I'm not making any noise, but the plant does seem to respond. What conclusions can you draw from this experimental data? Several years ago, I constructed a robotic teaching machine, ROBOTEACHER. I take off of the then popular movie RoboCop. I intended to have it operate only as a novelty in my science classroom, but Officer Pat Babin of the Shrewsbury Police Department asked if it could be used as part of her DARE program for our elementary schools. The Shrewsbury Lions Club sponsored the machine's travel, and Officer Babin and I presented an interactive program for our elementary schools. Students were invited to come up and interact with ROBOTEACHER. In the lower right, there's an image of ROBOTEACHER and students doing an actual experiment in plasma physics. In 1985, I applied for the NASA's Teacher in Space program. My application and interview went very well, but I failed the required hearing test. As you know, the Challenger shuttle mission and crew met a very tragic end on January the 28th, 1986. Still, my interest in space science endured. Later that year, I built the SHS StarQuest aerospace mission simulator out of 2 junked camper trailers. One trailer was designed to be mission control, while the other was a simulation of a space shuttle orbiter. I trained high school students, volunteers, to guide visiting middle school students as they simulated shuttle orbital tracking and human physiology experiments. Many former students remember me for my avian neurobiology demonstration, which came to be known by the misnomer chicken hypnosis. It is actually a non-invasive, drug-free means of relaxing a bird for assessing dislocations, broken bones, wounds, and other maladies. Here, a wing is being relaxed for inspection. The bird can also be completely relaxed for an X-ray. It is not unconscious, and it can be restored to normal physiological function almost immediately. In 1989, history teacher Mr. George James was tasked with recruiting teachers to become reenactors for the History of Shrewsbury Education Project. This was being sponsored by the Shrewsbury Historical Society. As you probably know by now, I love to explore new educational ventures. I instantly accepted his invitation to become an 18th century physician. My character, Dr. Edward A. Flynt, physician of the American Revolutionary War, was born that day. I was to become an Army physician under the command of Major General Artemus Ward, the first commanding general of the American Continental Army. That was before George Washington. Mr. Robert Cormier, then president of the Shrewsbury Historical Society, organized the History of Shrewsbury Education program. He helped me to develop my character by providing a biographical background. He also gave me this fabulous book, The Illustrated History of Surgery by Newt Hager. This was a wonderful resource for my program. There were many other sources that I used to prepare my program. Some of the best were The Horse and Buggy Doctor by Arthur E. Hertzler, Medicine in Colonial Massachusetts, edited by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and a 3-volume reproduction of the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It was edited in 1771 in Scotland. Much of the 3rd volume contained detailed information concerning disease diagnosis, medicinal preparations, and surgical instrument designs and procedures used at the time. Another reference, Every Man His Own Physician, edited by John Theobald, MD, sometimes contained questionable medical advice. For example, when treating snake bites, he recommends capturing and killing the offending snake, skinning and scraping the fat from its remains, and applying its fat to the wound. Specifically, quote, the fat of this animal rubbed into the part bitten prevents the ill consequences of such a wound. Where the fat cannot be procured, the same good effects will be produced by bathing the part well with warm salad oil. I know of no person who has ever had success using this method. In my opinion, it is inherently a dangerous thing to do and should be disregarded. My sponsor, Don Pottle, tells me I should tell you that if you're ever bitten by a snake, call 911. He says you'll understand what that means. To me, I'm not so sure. This is a set of 2 images, panoramic pictures of my home shop, where I create all of my presentation apparatus. I was able to get the schematic for an instrument chest used by Joshua Fisher in the Revolutionary War. This is its reconstruction. I use it for purposes of containing dental and surgical instruments for my presentations. Uniforms were purchased from Boston Costume, 200 Broadway Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and various shops in Williamsburg, Virginia. For safe transport during wartime, medicinals were often carried in rugged cases like this one. The top would contain a balance, apothecary flasks, various measuring cups and mixing devices, and even materials for making pills. The bottom of the chest contains the medications that most physicians of my time would be likely to carry in an army encampment. Among those medications would be copper sulfate, otherwise called blue vitriol. It's a very poisonous salt, but it's excellent when dissolved in water for treating trench foot in soldiers. It can even be used in abscesses for abscess control in hoofed animals. Remember, there were no veterinarians in my time. Valerian, not Valium. Valium is a synthetic benzodiazepine, but valerian is actually a decoction from the valerian plant root. And prepared properly, is very useful for treating insomnia and anxiety. Many of our soldiers suffered from this, especially before battle. Taking the bark of a willow tree, mixing it with vinegar and grinding it up, and a few other steps, will produce acetylsalicylic acid. The grinding process goes on in a mortar and pestle. Once filtered, the substance that results is a very powerful analgesic and anti-inflammatory. In 1922, the Bayer Corporation patented this formula and called it aspirin. Malaria, and we have a lot of that around. People with malaria often experience fever, chills, headache, back pain, and other flu-like symptoms. Left untreated, they may develop severe complications and die. Physicians of my time in the Army almost always carries quinine from the Cinchona calisaya plant. Sometimes it's called Peruvian bark. Mixed properly and given to people over a length of time, it does control malaria very well, and then sometimes it'll cure it. But there's one form of malaria that is resistant, and the person might have to be on quinine for the rest of his life to control the disease. It was later discovered that malaria, dengue, yellow fever are all diseases carried by mosquitoes. In our time, we thought it was bad air, and that's what malaria actually means. We now know, and you do too, that mosquitoes carry these diseases, and many scientists regard the mosquito as essentially being the most dangerous animal on the face of the earth, other than mankind, I presume. When our soldiers were living on what they could forage from the land, they sometimes consumed contaminated meat and poisonous plants. There was no refrigeration in those days and no specific antidotes for poison. This plant has pea pods that have a little furry surface on them. It should be easy to identify. And whatever you do, don't eat these things. It contains a very powerful blood anticoagulant. It's called beta-aminopropionitrile for you toxicologists out there. So try to avoid having your animals eat it as well. Otherwise, the risk is internal bleeding. Datastramonium, otherwise called Jimson weed or angel's trumpet, contains seeds which contain hallucinogens, and also a drug that you actually use in your modern medicine called atropine. Taken in excess, it can produce great mental disturbances and is in its own right quite poisonous. The most poisonous plant we have growing in the Northeast is probably Cicada virosa, or water hemlock. It looks a lot like Queen Anne's lace. Animals and even people are inclined to eat this for whatever the reason, and it's known for producing seizures and sometimes death. Amanita phalloides is a common mushroom, but it is poisonous. It contains a substance called amatoxin and is responsible for irreversible liver failure. Don't eat mushrooms unless you really know what you're doing. Then, interestingly, poison ivy, Toxicodendron radicans. On their leaf surface, there are oil droplets called urushiol. It's a very powerful skin irritant. Maybe you've had poison ivy yourself. When our soldiers would get it, it would disable them, especially if it got in their eyes. Treatment for poison ivy in our days is nothing more than compresses and maybe an oatmeal bath. It might help, but it generally takes about 3 weeks to clear the skin lesions. For the other poisons I alluded to, ipecac, which is a powerful emetic, and it causes vomiting. That can sometimes clear it out of the stomach. But if there is a long-term absorption of this substance, it might be worthwhile to use jalap. And this is a powerful defecation accelerant or a cathartic. One way or the other, the idea is to get these products out of the digestive system as soon as one can. Calomel is a very common drug used at our time. It's mercurous chloride, and it's used quite commonly to get rid of roundworms in the intestine. Ascaris lumbricoides can sometimes grow to a length of 12 inches. And if there's a great population of them in the intestine, what happens is an obstruction will occur. Sometimes the intestine actually bursts, peritonitis, and soon after death. But calomel is a very powerful reagent for getting rid of these worms and others as well. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease characterized by whole body rash, open sores, muscle aches, fever, swollen glands, patchy hair loss, and headaches. In the late stages of the disease, dementia is common, followed by death. Interestingly, calomel can slow the disease down. It's not a cure, but it does slow the disease down. Calomel was also used as an effective purgative and fungicide. It became the go-to drug of the 1700s. Unfortunately, being a mercurial, calomel causes neuropathies, kidney failure, severe mouth ulcers, and loss of teeth. Syphilis treatments would typically go on for years, and many patients died of mercurial poisoning rather than from syphilis. As an aside, in 1854, a safer and more effective treatment for syphilis was developed by Paul Ehrlich, an arsenical-based compound. It came to be known as salvarsan. King Louis XIV of France and King Charles II of England contracted syphilis in the usual way and hired wig makers to hide their syphilitic alopecia and retain their sartorial resplendency. This is about the middle of the 1600s. Wigs, then called perukes, became a popular fad and eventually a European tradition. You've probably heard the term big wig to denote somebody of high political stature or great wealth. Dover's powders, another common medication carried by physicians in wartime. It's composed of dry opium and ipecac. The two substances together act synergistically to become a very powerful analgesic, and it's excellent for controlling tooth pain and migraines. The inventor of Dover's powders, Dr. Thomas Dover, became unhappy in his profession as a physician and applied to the Continental Congress to become a licensed privateer, in other words, a pirate. He was given a letter of marque and reprisal, and he began his new career by attacking British merchant ships. If you become disenchanted with your current profession, our US Constitution still allows you to apply for a pirate's license. Let me show you the stage that I'm not otherwise able to show you because of the COVID restrictions. If we were to meet face-to-face for an ordinary presentation on my part, this is what we would have at the very front of the auditorium. All the things necessary to talk about the apothecary pharmacy component, surgery, dentistry, and many other things, actually. The presentation 30 years ago was a reminder that many physicians were also farmers. Most doctors couldn't make a living doing their ministrations, but farming was a reasonably secure profession, and many doctors were both, as was in my case, actually. Medical training in the 1700s, most physicians learned their craft through apprenticeship with other physicians. There were two medical schools at the time, King's College and the University of Pennsylvania. Interestingly, patient contact experience was not offered at that time. I got much of my information and practiced my trade based on as I mentioned before, volume 3 of the Encyclopedia Britannica. There were medical certifications. Some physicians were awarded certification from the Massachusetts Medical Society and earned the right to have the letters MMS after their name. At a later time, Western Medical Society offered medical certifications. Much of the surgery and bloodletting that was performed in the 1700s was done by barber surgeons, and barber poles were often painted with a flowing red stripe to indicate this service. We see this even today, but it's rare to see any barber of modern day science offering bleeding as a medication approach. Childbirthing was still mainly performed by midwives. Now, Army physicians often performed their craft in open fields and tents, but the Shrewsbury Historical Society invited me to do my presentation, as I said before, 30 years ago in this wonderful building with a fabulous audience. I'm sure you'd like. Have a look, please. See if you can answer this question. By the attending to where? Oh, that one. That would be quite simple to take care of. Thank you. You probably have already guessed that this is Mr. Michael Perna, our own Shrewsbury historian, and he's being prepared for a tooth extraction. These are the tools that one commonly uses if you're doing dental work. I assure you, none of these even came close to Mr. Perna. A client who comes in with a dental problem usually has considerable pain with one or more teeth. So one first applies oil of cloves, which contains a substance called eugenol. And this, for whatever the reason is, and even your scientists aren't absolutely sure why it works, but placed on the tooth that's compromised, sometimes quiets it down. But for the really heavy duty work that you have to do on teeth, for example, if you have abscesses that need to have extractions done, then laudanum is the drug of choice. Laudanum is an opium derivative and contains both morphine and codeine. When one mixes it with beer and any other alcoholic beverage and gives it to a client, and if you allow time for assimilation, this is a powerful pain reliever, but it is not a sedative that's likely to be used today, and it is not an anesthesia. The extraction process of a tooth involves these kinds of instrumentations. We call these tooth keys. I actually made one in my shop, oversized for demonstrations before the COVID situation hit. It's not very much more than a shaft with a grasping claw on the end of it. And the idea is, as the London dentist image shows you, to reach into the victim's mouth and using a twisting action with the tooth key, actually pull the teeth out. I like this painting. It's very detailed, and it's got some humorous components to it. Close up, you can almost see the tooth key at work and how determined the dentist is, and the lady of the house is suffering it out. In any case, the tooth key is placed over the tooth, and turning the shaft makes the tooth clamp securely into the jaws of this device. The more you turn it, the tighter it gets. But you can imagine what happens if you have a truly compromised tooth with many dental caries in it. It breaks off at the gum line. When that happens, the only approach is to use something called the periodontal elevator. This is essentially a shaft with a sharp knife at the end of it. And the idea is to push the elevator down into the tooth shaft between the tooth and the bone of the jaw. You do this with the intention of cutting the periodontal ligaments. These are the structures that actually hold the tooth in and make it so difficult to pull a tooth out. The It's not a comfortable procedure, that's for sure, but done parietally and medially, it does loosen the tooth up so that you can twist the elevator, and eventually part of the tooth will come up and it can be extracted using tooth extractors, which aren't very much different from pliers. Bleeding is a risk. Bleeding can be staunched by taking cotton or wool and pushing it down into the shaft and having the person bite down on it, or beeswax can be warmed up and put into the shaft. Failing that, a probe can be brought in, heated to orange hot, and the wound can be cauterized. That will stop the bleeding. People with vastly incomplete dentition sometimes cannot constrain their chewed food to their mouth, especially if they talk while eating and swallowing. A jabot, that's the correct pronunciation, is an ornately stylized bib, and it catches food and drink before it stains the clothing. Wrist cuffs are for wiping one's mouth. These actually caught on as styles in my time. Even I have one here. Now, this is a graphic I usually use when I'm talking about wiring a fractured jaw, but I wanted to make a point that you can use the same kind of procedure to put a tooth in place of the tooth that was withdrawn. In other words, a tooth implant. We did not invent the procedure, but it was done quite often, actually. Rich people would have it done, and if it's wired in place, it services quite well in many cases. I'm often asked the question, did George Washington have wooden dentures? And of course, I don't know. I have no idea. I can't find anything in the literature that suggests that he ever did. And if I never met the man, and if I did, I wouldn't talk about his dentition, that's for sure. But what he did have was a metal pewter base set dentures with teeth from animals and people, even slaves, wired and mounted into this metallic set of sockets. One of his dentures was equipped with a set of springs in the back so that the top and bottom denture would follow when Washington opened and closed his mouth. Cataracts are fairly common in my time, as I think they probably are in yours. Cataracts can develop within the crystalline lens of the eye, causing vision to become clouded. The condition is mainly age-related. One of the oldest surgeries to correct this condition is called cataract couching, where a needle is inserted at the periphery of the eye with the intent of pushing the clouded lens deep into the posterior chamber of the eye, thus clearing the vision path. This interesting graphic shows some of the instruments that are used in this process, and even in the three ovals, the technique for accomplishing cataract couching. You almost never see this done in modern countries now. The only place that practices it would be in some countries in West Africa. The lens of the eye having been moved, spectacles can restore focused imaging. Leaching. Whenever I do demonstrations of leaching in the classroom, of course, I use fake rubber leeches, so there's no harm to either the leech or anybody who decides to handle my preparation. The real leech is shown up at the top right. The use of leeches as a bloodletting tool has long been practiced by physicians of my time. The large Hirudis medicinalis leech from Scotland is preferred. Its saliva contains an anesthetic, which makes the bite from its three-part jaw nearly unnoticeable. Its saliva also contains the anticoagulant called hirudin that prevents the drawn blood from clotting. When the leech is fully engorged with blood, it automatically detaches, and the wound rarely gets infected. It can survive several weeks without the need to be fed again. In modern medicine, the leeches are sometimes used to restore blood flow or to limbs or fingers that require surgical grafting. In this case, our brave patriot, Dr. McGee, has elected to have leeches drain the blood from his deeply bruised eyes. This is a slower but far more safe means than the standard of using a fleam to drain wounds. By the way, Dr. McGee presented a very fine presentation concerning 18th to early 20th century medicine in Shrewsbury, Doctors and Their Times, just last May. Soldiers were sometimes assigned 4 or 5 to a field tent in shifts of 2 or 3 every 12 hours, a breeding ground for contagious diseases collectively known as camp fever. Here we have fever sufferer Mr. David Creedon being prepared for bloodletting. Every disease having febrile symptoms requires bleeding. Here's a list of them right here. The theory is that 4 humors must be in balance for health to be sustained. And any of these humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, or yellow bile, out of balance will produce any of these diseases over here. And the objective is for the physician to do whatever it takes to balance these humors. And one of the easiest things to do is to remove blood. And it's done all too routinely. So Mr. Creedon is going to be bled. The device used looks like a jackknife. It's a metal plate with a very sharp, razor sharp cutting edge right here. And this is used to cut a vein or an artery, usually in the arm. I prefer to do it in the ankle and inside of a bucket because the blood spray can be confined. Usually no more than 1 pint of blood is taken out at any time. And the way you know that the bleeding is becoming effective is you look at the skin pallor. If the red febrile condition turns a bit more white, you're probably doing the job well. George Washington contracted a severe case of epiglottitis. The epiglottis is a flap of tissue that closes over the trachea when one swallows food. In this case, the swollen epiglottis obstructed his airway, making breathing almost impossible. To treat the raging fever, attending physicians removed over half of his blood volume. It was about 3.7 liters out of 5.1. Washington died of a combination of airway obstruction, fever, and exsanguination on December the 14th, 1799, at age 67. Concussions were a very common war injury. If one gets hit in the head, the risk is that you can develop a bruised brain. The symptoms would include dizziness, double vision, headache, nausea, and ringing in the ears. Sometimes it gets so bad that the respiratory mechanism is suppressed. That's where your medical people might say that the victim has a subdural hematoma. Bleeding brains create pressure in the closed cranium, and it has to be relieved. And the age-old method of doing any corrective surgery on the brain and its surroundings was to be done by the use of a trepan or trephan. This is what we have here at the top of the screen. It's got a cylinder with some saw teeth in it, and there's a device on it that prevents the accidental intrusion into the brain space. There is some skin preparation that has to be done, but once it is, grinding with this tool through the cranium will relieve the pressure, and it actually is a mechanism of approved medicine even today. This graphic attempts to respond to questions often asked by audience members. The .75 caliber Brown Bess musket was the most common flintlock weapon used by the Americans and British. Its accuracy was improved when barrel rifling was introduced much later in the war. When fitted with a bayonet, it became an even more lethal weapon. A bayonet wound was medically untreatable and accounted for deaths by blood loss and infection. The blunderbuss was a much earlier flintlock, but had the advantage of being loaded with glass, pottery fragments, horseshoe nails, and even gravel if lead shot was not available. At a range of 40 feet, the blunderbuss produced contaminated, flesh-torn wounds that were almost impossible to effectively treat. At left is a picture of my grandson, Ryan, who often played the role of Army drummer boy in my presentations. Literature suggests that the youngest soldier in the American Army was about Ryan's actual age. This is what a 12-year-old soldier might look like. During the war, nearly 8,000 soldiers were killed in battle, and twice that number died from illness or starvation. Approximately 25,000 were wounded. 30% of the Army was killed, wounded, or captured. I'm not sure if this includes civilians, Native Americans, and slaves. Their lives matter too. Bullet wounds, very common in battle, obviously, and Mr. Warren Higgins is interested in having his bullet wound attended to. He's got a bullet wound in his leg. The devices in pulling out a bullet are shown here, but specifically the most useful ones would be the bullet extractor, which is a forceps really. It's important that the person stays still, so laudanum and some soldiers to hold the client down would be in order. And I bring up the point of the bite stick. I'm often asked, do surgeons give their clients a bullet to bite on before an operation begins? And I don't know of any case where that's actually done. Maybe it's true, but I haven't seen it, and I don't do it myself. The reason being, a bullet being held between the teeth is too easily dislodged and can become an obstructed airway. And that's something you don't want in the middle of any surgery. An easier and better way of handling this issue would be to take a stick, wrap it in cloth, wrap it again in any kind of a thread, and burn holes through the stick with a nail. And that will accommodate breathing. This can be held in place quite nicely, and it's a far better mechanism, I would think, to protect the teeth than any bullet that somebody might bite on. The bullet forceps reaches into the wound in this simple graphic with the intention of pulling the thing out. It can also be used for arrowheads. We had some Indians, Native Americans, who sometimes weren't very happy with us either. Sometimes these bullets flatten against the bone, and the only way to get them out is to use a bullet screw. A bullet screw is a shaft with a threaded end, and when placed into the wound and turned, the intention is to pull out the offending bullet in that manner. One of the problems that you have as a sequela of battles is hearing loss. Many soldiers experience hearing loss because of the battle explosions. And the ear trumpet actually works in a couple of different ways. It amplifies the sound, if you wear it, to maybe another 30 or 40%. But the other way it works is that when somebody is seen wearing one, the inclination to speak louder will help the person hear. Smallpox, especially variola major. Smallpox is an awful disease. It's just the world's worst practically. It causes pus-filled blisters to develop all over the body, even down inside the throat and on the tongue, under the tongue, and even into the voice box, the larynx. Symptoms also include high fever, fatigue, muscle aches, backaches, headaches. The whole body just hurts, and the inability to swallow food. And it can also produce vomiting, which is very awkward with this disorder. It was discovered that if pus and scabs from a recovering survivor were introduced into a healthy person, the inoculated person would contract a very mild form of the disease, variola minor. He would soon recover and then never contract the major form of the disease. This process is called variolation. This is a variolation box, and it contains the tools one uses for inoculating clients against smallpox. The procedure is find a volunteer, pay him if necessary, a person who is actually recovering from smallpox. And then a spatula can be used to scrape the scabs and exudate from the wounds and place into a crucible. Small pieces of thread are then introduced into the crucible and crushed and stirred by macerating forceps. Eventually, a piece of cotton can be brought to the crucible, and the cotton will pick up all of these little pieces of exudate soaked and scab soaked pieces of thread. Each little piece of thread represents an inoculum. This is the cut and thread method of variolation, and this is the method that George Washington insisted on having his soldiers receive. The thread is put into a small cut, bandage, and in about 3 days, if you see a reaction going on at the site, the probability is that this person will eventually become quite resistant to the more dangerous phase of smallpox. This can also be done by the forked needle method. The needle, having little tines, can be used to pick up the inoculum and then poked into the skin of the recipient 6 times usually. And eventually a little welt, a high area will develop, it will be red in color, rather itchy, but this just indicates that the inoculum is taking effect. If you happen to have a dime-sized scar on your arm or leg somewhere, this may be the method by which you were inoculated against smallpox many, many years ago. In ancient China, physicians sometimes blew dried smallpox exudates into clients' nostrils. This might have been the very first intranasal inoculation. But in any case, the recipient is always quarantined for 14 days, because during that time, he actually becomes contagious. Thanks to a worldwide vaccination campaign, smallpox was declared by the World Health Organization an eradicated disease in 1985. The only other animal disease to have been eradicated from the planet is rinderpest, cattle plague, which ravaged through Europe, Asia, and Africa. A vaccination campaign based on the science learned from smallpox variolation efforts eradicated this disease in 2011. Poliomyelitis, or polio, might be the next one on the list. You might have heard of herd immunity as applied to the SARS-2 COVID-19 virus. And this is what they're talking about. If you can get enough people or animals immunized against the virus, it'll have no place to grow and reproduce. And you can eliminate, theoretically, the disease. Rinderpest was an awful disease for any person to look at, because your prized animals would develop horrible, horrible mouth sores, diarrhea, discharge from the nose and eyes, and almost all of them would die no matter what you would do. But now rinderpest and smallpox are no longer on the face of the earth. Now here I have 2 radiographs. Obviously, I have no means of actually producing them myself, but my sponsor, Don, gave me these so I could show you the difference and similarities between a simple fracture of a fibula, let's say, and a compound fracture of both a fibula and tibia. In order to fix these fractures, the bones have to be reduced. Now that means pulling them apart so that the fragments of the bone can be manipulated back into their proper places for proper alignment for eventually healing. This can be done by using horse reins and people who are strong enough to stretch the infected leg so that it would be possible to push the bones back into their right orientation. A more reliable box is this device here. It's a tension box, and it's got a threaded rod, a stationary knee plate, and a movable ankle plate. The idea is, if you own one of these, when the crank is turned on this device, the threaded rod moves the ankle plate. and the fractured bones will then be manipulated back to their proper place. Reduced, in other words. Once these bones are in place, you can use splints or a cast. Examples here. Most bones take at least 60 days to heal. Sometimes a compound fracture will result in bones actually coming through the skin. This is a very unfortunate situation because it creates an infection site and is basically not curable by mechanisms of our time. Sometimes legs are shackled in slavery, and the slave will create a lot of erosion around the ankle and something called, you would call it necrotizing fasciitis. In our time, there's no treatment for that at all. And the only answer to save the lives of these people is, because of the gangrene, is to amputate the limb. These are the amputation tools. Tourniquets are used to stop the bleeding. Students in 804 Shrewsbury High School volunteered at one time at least to simulate an amputation for an audience. Once the tourniquet is applied, the amputation knife is used to make a deep circumferential incision above the knee all the way to the bone. By the way, the sharp edge of the amputation knife is the inner curved one. Bone saws are used to cut through the femur and the legs removed. Blood is slippery, as you might know. The handles of the amputation instruments are often wrapped in cloth to prevent their slipping in the hands of the surgeon. There are 4 major blood vessels that need to be ligated in order to prevent fatal bleeding. One of the complications of doing an amputation is blood loss. And here I'm showing how a surgeon's knot is used to close the vessels down. The wound is partially closed, not fully, and the wound is allowed to drain. The dressing put on the wound oftentimes is composed, if you can get it, of honey and egg white. It's been shown that this combination helped in the healing process, interestingly. Sutures are made from usually either horsehair, cotton thread, silk, or wire, as shown. This is a grapefruit, by the way, that Dr. Flynt is sewing up. After a good number of days, if the wound heals rightly, prostheses can be fabricated. This one is nothing more than a socket with a peg on it and a couple of straps to hold it to the upper thigh. But some of these leg prostheses were very sophisticated and had immense capacity for articulation. Oh, by the way, Bob Cormier offers a last opportunity for an audience member to volunteer for an unexpected procedure.
Dr. Flynt does have an encore. Do we have any volunteers for the prostate procedure?
From this point forward, Dr. Flynt visits high school classrooms, medical societies, other historical societies, and 5th grade Colonial Week celebrants throughout the Commonwealth. Now, this is a group of 5th graders helping Dr. Flynt demonstrate the amputation procedure. I love looking at the expressions here. I wonder how many people I've scared away from going into the medical profession. General Artemis Ward came in room 804, hoping to get his abscessed tooth extracted. We, of course, gave him the best laudanum in the house and naturally the most humane procedure for tooth extraction that was available at the time. This picture, again, was taken about 30 years ago in room 804 at the Shrewsbury High School. And I noticed that Mrs. Isabel Chang is in the audience. She was our librarian at the time. And I make a point of this because just less than a year ago, I did a presentation at the Shrewsbury Senior Center, and she attended that as well. So Mrs. Chang, you're always invited to come to my presentations. Thank you for your interest. Students here are helping to illustrate for the audience a variety of procedures and administrations by Dr. Flynt. One thing that I'm so marveled about is that I've never had any resistance for student audiences to help me in producing my presentations. They're always enthusiastic, good-humored, and serious about learning. They're fabulous people. No wonder we won the war. I have a lot of acknowledgements to make, unending really. Mr. George James, thank you. Our brave participants, David Creedon, Warren Higgins, Paula Lupton, Dr. McGee, Dale McGee, Bob Cormier, Mike Perna, Officer Pat Babin and the Shrewsbury Police Department, the Shrewsbury Lions Club, and the millions and millions, it seems, of all my wonderful participants and audiences that made my presentations so effective and enjoyable. Acknowledgements go to Eric Larson, Chris Gustafson, Paul Gustafson, Karen Underkoffler, Sue Falzoy, and all the members of the Shrewsbury Historical Society that had the amazing patience to help me present this program tonight. This is where Dr. Flynt began, the Shrewsbury Historical Society. Thank you all. And there's one more thing. I should remind you that no animals or people were harmed while making this presentation. And please do not forget to wear your mask. Happy Halloween, everybody. Good night.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Pottle. That was a wonderful presentation. I see a lot of old faces from the Shrewsbury Historical Society there. It was very, very good. Very, very interesting.
I'm glad it worked out all the way around. Thank you for
Yes,
all your technical expertise in making this happen.
thank you very much. It was really great. Our next presentation is on November 17th, 2021. John Horrigan will present the Titanic. Thank you for coming out tonight, and I hope to see you next month.